David never thought that helping out at a local animal shelter would completely change his life. He was just a regular guy who worked with computers all day, fixing problems and writing code. After sitting in front of screens for hours, he wanted to do something meaningful with his free time. That's how he ended up volunteering at Happy Paws Animal Rescue every weekend. The shelter was always busy. Dogs barking, cats meowing, and volunteers rushing around trying to take care of all the animals that needed help. David loved it there. He wasn't the most social person, but something about being around animals made him feel calm and happy. The other volunteers were friendly, and the shelter manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, always had a warm smile for everyone who helped out. One Saturday morning in October, David arrived at the shelter like always. The air was crisp, and fall leaves were scattered across the parking lot. Mrs. Rodriguez met him at the entrance with a worried look on her face. "David, I'm so glad you're here early today," she said, wringing her hands. "We had a storm last night, and part of our back fence got damaged. Some of the metal panels are bent and twisted. I'm worried the dogs might get out if we don't fix it soon." David had never done much construction work, but he was willing to help. The shelter didn't have much money, and they couldn't afford to hire professional workers for every little problem. Several other volunteers had already gathered in the backyard, looking at the damaged fence and trying to figure out the best way to fix it. The storm had been brutal. Wind and rain had knocked down 3 fence panels, and the metal posts were twisted at odd angles. Sharp edges of bent metal stuck out everywhere, making the area look like a disaster zone. David could see why Mrs. Rodriguez was worried. If any of the dogs got loose and wandered into traffic, it would be terrible. "We need to remove these damaged panels first," said Tom, an older volunteer who had some experience with home repairs. "Then we can put up temporary barriers until we get new fencing installed." Everyone got to work. David paired up with Lisa, a college student who volunteered every weekend. They started working on removing one of the most damaged panels. The metal was heavy and awkward to handle. Every time they tried to lift it, sharp edges would catch on something or the weight would shift unexpectedly. "This is trickier than I thought," Lisa said, wiping sweat from her forehead even though the morning was still cool. David agreed. The twisted metal seemed to have a mind of its own. Just when they thought they had a good grip on it, the panel would slip or rotate in a way that made it even harder to control. They had been working for about an hour when disaster struck. They were trying to lift a particularly heavy section when the metal suddenly shifted. David reached out instinctively to catch it before it could fall on Lisa's foot. His hand shot forward, and before he realized what was happening, a jagged edge of metal sliced deep across his palm. The pain was immediate and intense. Blood started flowing right away, and David knew this wasn't just a small cut. The metal had gone deep, creating a gash that ran diagonally across his entire palm in an unusual zigzag pattern. "Oh no, David," Lisa screamed when she saw the blood. Mrs. Rodriguez came running over, took one look at David's hand, and immediately called for an ambulance. While they waited, she wrapped his hand in clean towels, but the blood kept seeping through. David felt dizzy and had to sit down on the ground. "Don't worry, you're going to be okay," Mrs. Rodriguez kept saying, but David could see the concern in her eyes. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt much longer to David. The paramedics quickly examined his hand and decided he needed immediate surgery. The cut had gone through muscle and possibly damaged tendons. This wasn't something that could be fixed with just stitches. At the hospital, David was rushed into surgery. The doctors worked for 3 hours to repair the damage. When he woke up, his entire hand was wrapped in thick bandages and his arm was in a sling. The surgeon, Dr. Kim, came to check on him. "The good news is that we were able to repair most of the damage," Dr. Kim explained. "However, you're going to have a significant scar, and it might take several months before your hand works normally again. You'll need physical therapy and a lot of patience over the next few weeks." David had to take time off from his computer job because he couldn't type properly. The injury was on his right hand, and even simple tasks like brushing his teeth or eating became challenging. He felt frustrated and stuck at home with nothing to do. As his hand healed, something strange began to happen. The scar that formed wasn't like anything the doctors had seen before. Instead of a straight line, it created an intricate pattern that almost looked like ancient symbols or maybe tree branches. Dr. Kim said that sometimes scars form in unusual ways, especially when there's significant tissue damage, but David's scar was particularly unique. Even stranger were the dreams that started during his recovery. David found himself dreaming about forests, animals, and places he'd never been. In these dreams, he could somehow understand what animals were thinking and feeling. He would wake up feeling like these dreams were more real than his actual life. When he was finally able to return to happy paws, something had definitely changed. The animals seemed different around him, or maybe he was different around them. Dogs that were usually nervous or aggressive would calm down when he approached. Cats that normally hid from strangers would come right up to him and purr. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed it too. "David, I don't know what's different about you, but the animals absolutely love you now. Even Rex, that big dog who growls at everyone, just melts whenever you're around." David didn't know how to explain what was happening because he didn't understand it himself. All he knew was that the accident had changed something fundamental about who he was, and he was just beginning to discover what that might mean. 6 months had passed since David's accident, and life had slowly returned to normal, or at least what felt normal. His hand had healed well enough for him to go back to his computer job, though he still felt twinges of pain when the weather changed. The scar remained as mysterious as ever, looking like some kind of ancient symbol that no doctor could explain. David had gotten used to the strange dreams and his unusual connection with animals. He'd started thinking maybe it was all in his head, just his imagination running wild after the trauma. But deep down, he knew something real had changed inside him. On a rainy Thursday evening in April, David decided to explore a new part of town. He heard about a bookstore called Ancient Pages that specialized in old books about history and culture. As someone who spent most of his time with computers, David found himself drawn to things from the past lately. Maybe it was because of his strange dreams, or maybe he just needed a break from modern technology. The bookstore was tucked between a coffee shop and a vintage clothing store on a quiet street lined with old oak trees. The windows were filled with displays of thick, leather-bound books and old maps. A small bell chimed when David pushed open the heavy wooden door. The smell hit him immediately, that wonderful mixture of old paper, leather, and something that reminded him of libraries from his childhood. The store was much bigger inside than it looked from the street, with tall shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, and narrow walkways winding between them like a maze. David wandered through the sections, running his fingers along the spines of books about ancient civilizations, folklore, and mythology. He'd never been interested in this stuff before his accident, but now these topics fascinated him in ways he couldn't explain. He was browsing through a section on Celtic history when he first noticed her. A woman about his age was standing near the mythology section, holding a stack of books that looked heavy enough to break someone's back. She had long, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and was wearing a green sweater that seemed to match her eyes perfectly. What caught David's attention wasn't just how she looked, but the way she was watching him every time he glanced in her direction. She quickly looked away, pretending to read the book titles. It wasn't creepy or uncomfortable, just curious, like she was trying to figure something out about him. David continued browsing, but he could feel her eyes on him. When he moved to a different section, she seemed to follow at a distance, always staying a few shelves away but keeping him in sight. Finally, he decided to test his theory. He deliberately walked to the far corner of the store where books about ancient symbols and languages were kept. Sure enough, a minute later, she appeared in the same section, though she was trying hard to look casual about it. David pulled a book about Celtic symbols from the shelf and pretended to read it, but he was really watching her reflection in the window beside him. She was definitely studying him, and her focus seemed to be on his hands. David realized he'd been unconsciously flexing his right hand, the one with the scar, as he held the book. The scar was mostly hidden by his sleeve, but sometimes when he moved certain ways, part of it would show. After about 10 minutes of this strange dance, the woman finally approached him. She walked over slowly, like someone trying not to scare away a wild animal, and cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she said, and David noticed she had a slight accent he couldn't place. "I couldn't help but notice you're looking at books about Celtic symbols. Are you researching something specific?" David turned to face her properly for the first time. Her eyes were indeed green, but they had an intensity that made him feel like she could see right through him. There was something familiar about her, though he was certain they'd never met before. "Not really researching," David replied, closing the book. "Just curious, I guess. I've been having some strange dreams lately, and they involve symbols that look kind of like these." Her eyes widened slightly, and David saw something flash across her face. Excitement, maybe, or recognition. She glanced down at his hands again, and this time she didn't try to hide it. "Dreams about symbols," she repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Sometimes our minds try to tell us things in ways we don't expect." David found himself drawn into conversation with this mysterious woman. She told him her name was Elena, and she was a researcher studying historical connections between different cultures. She traveled a lot for her work, visiting libraries and museums around the world. "What kind of symbols do you see in your dreams?" Elena asked, and there was something in her tone that made David feel like his answer was very important to her. He described the tree-like patterns and strange markings that appeared in his dreams, the ones that seemed to move and shift like they were alive. As he talked, Elena's expression grew more and more interested, and she kept glancing at his hands. "You know," Elena said carefully, "sometimes people develop connections to ancient knowledge after significant life experiences. Trauma, accidents, near-death experiences, they can open doorways in our minds that were previously closed." David felt a chill run down his spine. How could this stranger know about his accident? He hadn't mentioned it to her. "I'm sorry, but how did you—" he started to say, but Elena interrupted him. "Your energy," she said simply. "There's something different about you, something that suggests you've been through a transformative experience recently." David wasn't sure what to make of this conversation. Part of him wanted to dismiss Elena as just another person interested in mystical nonsense, but something about her seemed genuine and knowledgeable. Plus, she was describing things he'd been experiencing but hadn't told anyone about. As they talked, David found himself unconsciously adjusting his sleeve. The bookstore was warm, and his jacket was getting uncomfortable. When he rolled up his sleeves, Elena's entire demeanor changed. Her eyes locked onto his right hand, specifically, onto the distinctive scar that ran across his palm. The book she was holding slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a loud thud, but she didn't seem to notice. She was staring at David's scar with an expression of complete shock and something that looked almost like relief. "May I?" she whispered, reaching toward his hand and then stopping herself. "May I see that more clearly?" David felt confused but curious. He extended his hand toward her, and Elena leaned in to examine the scar closely. Her breathing became rapid, and her hands were actually shaking. "How long have you had this mark?" she asked in a voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. "About 6 months," David replied. "I had an accident while volunteering at an animal shelter." "Why? What's wrong?" Elena looked up at him, and David saw tears forming in her eyes. She appeared to be struggling with some internal decision, weighing whether or not to say something that was clearly very important to her. Elena stared at David's scar for what felt like forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. The bookstore suddenly felt very quiet around them, as if the whole world had stopped to listen to whatever was about to happen next. Finally, Elena reached out and gently took David's hand in both of hers. Her touch was surprisingly warm, almost hot, and David felt a strange tingling sensation run up his arm. It wasn't painful, but it was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. It felt like electricity, but softer and more alive somehow. Elena traced the pattern of his scar with one finger, following each twist and curve like she was reading a map. Her touch was so light it was barely there. But David could feel every movement as if his scar had become incredibly sensitive to her presence. "This is incredible," she whispered, more to herself than to him, after all this time, after searching. In so many places David was starting to feel uncomfortable. The way Eleanor was acting made him wonder if she might be a little unstable. Maybe she was one of those people who believed in conspiracy theories, or thought they could predict the future by reading palms. "Look, I don't really believe in fortune telling," or David started to say, trying to gently pull his hand away. But Eleanor's grip tightened, not roughly, but with urgency. She looked up at him with those intense green eyes, and David saw that she was completely serious. There was no craziness there, no wild imagination. Whatever she was thinking, she believed it completely. "This isn't fortune-telling," Eleanor said firmly. "This is something much more real and much more rare than most people could ever imagine." She glanced around the bookstore to make sure no one else was close enough to hear them, then leaned in closer to David. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was crystal clear. "I've finally found you, human." David felt like someone had just dumped ice water over his head. The way she said human, like it was something special, something unusual, made his skin crawl and his heart race at the same time. He tried to step back, but Eleanor still had hold of his hand. "What did you just say?" David asked, his voice shaking slightly. Eleanor seemed to realize how her words had sounded, and she quickly looked around again before speaking in a more normal tone. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong. What I meant is, I've been looking for a human with your specific marking for over 2 years now. You have no idea how hard it's been to find someone like you." David managed to pull his hand free and took a step backward, bumping into the bookshelf behind him. Several books shifted and one fell to the floor, but he barely noticed. "Someone like me? What are you talking about? It's just a scar from an accident. There's nothing special about it." Eleanor bent down and picked up the book that had fallen, then straightened up and looked directly into David's eyes. What he saw there wasn't craziness or delusion. It was the look of someone who had been searching for something very important for a very long time and had finally found it. "David, that's not just any scar," she said calmly, "and you know it's not. You've been having the dreams, haven't you? The ones where you can understand animals, where you feel connected to nature in ways you never did before." David's blood turned cold. He had never told anyone about his dreams, not even the doctors during his recovery. How could this stranger possibly know about them? "How do you know about my dreams?" he demanded, his voice getting louder despite his efforts to stay calm. Eleanor raised her hands in a calming gesture, the same way someone might try to settle down a frightened animal. "Because I have dreams too," she said simply, "and so do others like us. People who have been marked." She rolled up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing a scar that ran from her elbow almost to her wrist. It was older than David's, more faded, but the pattern was unmistakably similar. Not identical, but clearly related, like they were words written in the same strange language. "I got this when I was 12, Eleanor explained. "Lightning strike during a camping trip with my family. The doctors said I was incredibly lucky to survive, but they couldn't explain why the scar formed this way for years. I thought I was going crazy because of the things I started experiencing afterward." David stared at her scar, then at his own, then back at her face. The world suddenly felt much larger and more mysterious than it had just a few minutes ago. "What kind of things?" he asked quietly. "I can sense what animals are feeling," Eleanor said. "Not their thoughts exactly, but their emotions, their intentions, their pain or happiness. I can tell when they're sick before any symptoms show up. Sometimes I can even influence their behavior, calm them down or encourage them to trust people who are trying to help them." David's knees felt weak. Everything Eleanor was describing matched his own experiences at the animal shelter. The things he'd been trying to convince himself were just his imagination. "But that's impossible," he said, though even as the words came out, he didn't believe them. "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "Think about what's been happening to you since your accident. Really think about it." The dreams, the way animals react to you now, the feeling that you can almost understand what they're trying to tell you. David sat down heavily on a small stool that was tucked between two bookshelves. His mind was racing, trying to process everything Elena was telling him. Even if what you're saying is true, how did you find me? How did you know to look for me? Elena pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket and flipped through several pages covered with sketches and notes. I'm part of a research group, she explained. We study people who develop these abilities after traumatic events that leave specific types of scars. We've documented cases going back hundreds of years, maybe longer. She showed David some of the sketches in her notebook. They were drawings of scars, all different but sharing certain characteristics that were clearly visible in both his and Elena's markings. We call people like us bridge people, Elena continued. We think that trauma somehow activates parts of the brain that most humans don't use anymore. Abilities that our ancestors might have had but lost over time. That sounds like science fiction, David said, but he was studying the drawings with fascination. A lot of real science sounds like fiction until we understand it better, Eleanor replied. Look, I know this is overwhelming. I felt the same way when I first learned about others like me. But David, you have a gift, something that could help animals and humans understand each other in ways that could change the world. David looked up from the notebook and saw that Elena was watching him with a mixture of hope and excitement. He realized that this encounter wasn't random at all. She had been actively searching for him, or at least for someone like him. How many people like us are there? He asked. More than you might think, but still very few. Maybe 1 in a million people have the potential, and even fewer actually develop the abilities after their marking event. We've found 12 others so far, scattered across different countries. Elena closed her notebook and put it back in her pocket, then sat down on another small stool across from David. I know this is a lot to take in, she said gently, but I hope you'll let me introduce you to the others in our research group. They can explain things much better than I can, and they have equipment that can actually measure some of what's happening in your brain when you connect with animals. David felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would completely change his understanding of himself and the world around him. Part of him wanted to run away and pretend this conversation had never happened, but a bigger part of him was desperately curious to learn more. What would I have to do? He asked. 3 days later, David found himself standing outside a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. Elena had given him the address and told him to come to the 3rd floor, but she hadn't prepared him for how nervous he would feel. His palms were sweaty, and he kept checking his watch, wondering if he was making a huge mistake. The building looked like any other office complex, with tinted windows and a small lobby with fake plants. David had expected something more mysterious, maybe hidden away in some remote location. Instead, it felt like he was going to a dentist appointment or meeting with an accountant. Elena met him in the lobby, and David was relieved to see a familiar face. She was wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater, looking much more casual than she had in the bookstore. Her smile was warm and reassuring, which helped calm some of David's anxiety. I'm so glad you decided to come, she said as they walked toward the elevator. I know this must feel overwhelming, but I promise you're going to be amazed by what you learned today. The elevator took them to the 3rd floor, where the hallway looked like a typical office building with beige carpet and fluorescent lighting. But when Elena opened the door marked Research Associates, David stepped into something completely different. The space had been converted into what looked like a combination of a laboratory, library, and comfortable living room. One wall was covered with charts, graphs, and photographs. Another wall had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with books in different languages. In the center of the room were several comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, and off to one side was an area with computers and equipment that David didn't recognize. 3 people were waiting for them, and Elena introduced them one by one. There was Dr. Chen, an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes who specialized in studying the brain. Next was Roberto, a man about David's age who had thick glasses and seemed excited about everything. Finally, there was Maya, a woman in her 40s who had a calm, peaceful presence that reminded David of a meditation teacher. "Welcome, David," Dr. Chen said, shaking his hand warmly. "Elena has told us about your experiences. We're very interested to learn more about your abilities and hopefully help you understand what's been happening to you." They all sat down in the circle of chairs, and David noticed that each person had visible scars somewhere on their body. Roberto had one on his forearm. Maya had what looked like burn marks on her neck. And Dr. Chen had a scar that ran across her forehead, partially hidden by her hair. "The first thing you should know," Dr. Chen began, "is that you're not alone. And you're not crazy. What you've been experiencing is real, and we have scientific evidence to prove it." Roberto pulled out a laptop and showed David brain scans that looked like colorful maps of neural activity. The images were beautiful but confusing, with different areas lighting up in bright colors. "These are brain scans of people like us," Roberto explained excitedly. "See these areas here? In most people, these regions show minimal activity. But in bridge people like you and me, they're incredibly active. It's like someone turned on lights in parts of the brain that are usually dark." Maya leaned forward and spoke in a gentle voice. "The trauma that created your scar didn't just damage your hand, David. It somehow activated dormant neural pathways that most humans never access. We think these might be abilities that our ancient ancestors had but lost over thousands of years of evolution." David stared at the brain scans, trying to understand what he was seeing. "But how is that possible? How can an injury to my hand affect my brain?" Dr. Chen smiled. "That's the fascinating part. We believe the specific type of trauma, combined with certain genetic factors, creates a kind of neurological awakening. It's not the physical injury itself, but the way your brain responds to it that creates the change." Elena stood up and walked over to a large whiteboard covered with notes and diagrams. "We've documented 12 cases like yours over the past 5 years. Every person had a traumatic event that left a distinctive scar pattern, and every person developed enhanced abilities to connect with animals." She pointed to photographs on the wall showing people with various animals. In one photo, a man was surrounded by a pack of wild dogs that looked completely calm and peaceful. In another, a woman had her hand on a horse's neck, and both of them looked like they were communicating without words. "These are some of our other bridge people," Elena explained. "This man, Peter, can calm aggressive animals just by being near them. This woman, Lisa, can sense when animals are sick or injured before any physical symptoms appear." Each person has slightly different abilities, but we all share the basic connection. Roberto clapped his hands together with enthusiasm. "But here's the really exciting part, David. We want to test your specific abilities today, if you're willing. We have some animals here that we work with regularly, and we'd love to see how you interact with them." David felt his heart start beating faster. The idea of being tested made him nervous, but he was also incredibly curious to find out if his experiences at the animal shelter were really as special as these people seemed to think. "What kind of tests?" he asked. Dr. Chen stood up and gestured toward a door at the back of the room. "Nothing scary or painful. We just want to observe how you interact with animals in a controlled environment. We have sensors that can measure brain activity, heart rate, and other biological markers while you're connecting with them." Maya added, "We also want to see if you can demonstrate any of the abilities Elena described to us. Can you sense what an animal is feeling? Can you influence their behavior? Can you communicate with them in ways that go beyond normal human-animal interaction?" They led David through the door into another room that was set up like a comfortable veterinary clinic. There were examination tables, medical equipment, and several large cages along one wall. David could see animals in some of the cages, a few cats, what looked like a small dog, and something that might have been a rabbit. All of these animals are rescues, Elena explained quickly, seeing David's concerned expression. "They're not here for experiments or anything harmful. They live here temporarily while we help them recover from injuries or find new homes." Working with them is actually part of their rehabilitation. Dr. Chen attached several small sensors to David's forehead and temples. They were connected to wires that led to a computer screen, showing wavy lines that Roberto explained represented his brain activity. Just try to relax, Dr. Chen said. We're going to bring out Buddy first. He's a dog who was badly mistreated before he came to us. He's been with us for 3 months. But he still doesn't trust humans very much. Maya opened one of the larger cages and gently coaxed out a medium-sized dog with brown and white fur. Buddy kept his head down and his tail tucked between his legs as he reluctantly followed Maya into the center of the room. David could immediately sense the animal's fear and mistrust. Just sit on the floor and let him come to you if he wants. 2, Elena suggested. Don't force anything. David sat down cross-legged on the floor about 6 feet away from Buddy. The dog looked at him with suspicious eyes, clearly ready to run back to his cage at the first sign of danger. David felt that familiar tingling sensation he'd experienced at the animal shelter, like an electric current connecting him to the frightened animal. Without thinking about it, David began to project feelings of calm and safety toward Buddy. He didn't know how he was doing it, but he could somehow sense the dog's emotions and respond to them. Gradually, Buddy's posture began to change. His tail came up slightly, and he took a tentative step toward David. This is incredible, Roberto whispered, staring at the computer screen. Look at these readings. David's brain activity is off the charts, and somehow it's synchronizing with the dog's stress patterns. Over the next 10 minutes, David watched in amazement as Buddy slowly approached him, eventually coming close enough for David to gently pet him. The dog's transformation was remarkable, from a terrified, cowering animal to one that seemed genuinely happy and relaxed. But the real shock came when David looked up at the computer screen, showing his brain activity. The wavy lines had changed into complex patterns that pulsed and flowed in rhythm with his interactions with Buddy. It was visual proof that something extraordinary was happening in his mind. David left the research facility that day with his mind spinning like a tornado. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about life, about what was possible in the world had been turned upside down in just a few hours. The brain scans, the tests with the animals, the proof that his abilities were real. It was almost too much to process. For the next week, David went through the motions of his regular life. He showed up at his computer programming job, sat in meetings, wrote code, and pretended everything was normal. But inside, he felt like he was living a lie. How could he go back to fixing software bugs when he had just discovered he could communicate with animals in ways that science was only beginning to understand? His coworkers noticed something was different about him. During lunch breaks, instead of scrolling through his phone like usual, David found himself staring out the window at the pigeons on the fire escape. When his manager asked if he was feeling okay, David just nodded and said he was going through some personal stuff. The truth was, David couldn't stop thinking about Buddy, the frightened rescue dog from the research facility. The way the animal had transformed in his presence, going from terrified to trusting in just a few minutes, felt more meaningful than anything David had accomplished in years of computer programming. Elena called him every few days to check on how he was adjusting to everything they'd discovered. During one of their conversations, she mentioned that the team was planning to visit a wildlife rehabilitation center the following weekend to work with some injured animals that weren't responding well to traditional treatment methods. Would you like to come with us? Elena asked. It might help you understand how your abilities could make a real difference in the world. David said yes without hesitation. He told his friends he was going camping for the weekend, which wasn't technically a lie since the rehabilitation center was out in the countryside. The Wild Heart Rehabilitation Center was located on 50 acres of forest and meadow, about 2 hours outside the city. When David arrived with Elena and the research team, he was amazed by how peaceful the place felt. There were large enclosures scattered throughout the property, housing everything from injured hawks to orphaned deer. The center's director, a woman named Patricia who had been running the facility for 20 years, greeted them warmly. She had worked with Elena's team before and was excited to see what David could do. "We have several animals that have been struggling," Patricia explained as she led them along a winding path through the trees. "Sometimes trauma affects animals in ways that go beyond physical injuries. They stop eating, become aggressive, or just withdraw completely. Traditional methods don't always help them heal emotionally." Their first stop was an enclosure housing a red-tailed hawk that had been found with a broken wing. 3 months earlier, the wing had healed perfectly, but the bird refused to fly. It just sat on a low perch, staring at the ground with what looked like deep sadness in its eyes. "We've tried everything," Patricia said. "The wing is completely functional now, but something is keeping her grounded. We're worried she may never be able to return to the wild." David approached the enclosure slowly, feeling that familiar electric sensation building in his chest as he got closer to the hawk. He began to sense something that felt like overwhelming fear mixed with a deep sense of loss. The bird wasn't just physically injured, she was heartbroken. Images began flowing through David's mind, almost like watching a movie. He saw the hawk with a mate, building a nest high in an old oak tree. He saw eggs hatching and baby birds learning to fly. Then he saw the accident that had broken her wing. And something else, her mate being killed by a car while trying to defend their territory. Without fully understanding what he was doing, David began projecting feelings of comfort and hope toward the hawk. He somehow communicated that she was safe now, that her mate's death wasn't her fault, and that she could honor his memory by returning to the sky where she belonged slowly. The hawk lifted her head and looked directly at David. For several minutes, they seemed to have a silent conversation that no one else could hear. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the hawk spread her wings wide and took flight, circling the enclosure with powerful, graceful strokes. Everyone watching gasped in amazement. Patricia had tears in her eyes as she watched the hawk soar. "In 20 years of doing this work, I've never seen anything like that," she whispered. Over the course of that weekend, David worked with 6 more animals. Each time, he discovered that he could not only sense their emotions and physical condition, but also help them overcome trauma and fear that traditional methods couldn't reach. A wolf with separation anxiety learned to trust again. A deer that had been refusing to eat began grazing normally. An injured owl that had been plucking out its own feathers stopped the destructive behavior and began preening normally. But the most powerful moment came on Sunday afternoon when Patricia brought David to meet Thunder, a horse that had been rescued from terrible conditions at a neglect case. Thunder had been so badly treated that he wouldn't let any human come within 10 feet of him. He had been at the center for almost a year, and Patricia was running out of options. When David first saw Thunder, he was struck by how beautiful the horse was despite his obvious suffering. Thunder was a large black stallion with intelligent eyes that held both strength and deep pain. He stood in the far corner of his paddock, watching David with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. David spent 2 hours just sitting quietly outside Thunder's enclosure, not trying to approach or force any interaction. Instead, he focused on projecting feelings of respect, understanding, and patience. He let Thunder know, without words, that he understood the horse's pain and wasn't going to hurt him. Gradually, Thunder began to move closer, first just a few steps, then a little more, until finally he was standing right at the fence where David sat. When Thunder gently touched David's outstretched hand with his nose, David felt a connection so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. Elena, who had been watching from a distance, later told David that she had never seen anything like it. Even Dr. Chen, who had studied bridge people for years, was amazed by the strength of David's abilities. That night, as David drove home through the dark countryside, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't go back to his old job, his old routine, his old way of thinking about what was important. He had found his calling, his purpose, his reason for being in the world. The next morning, David walked into his manager's office and gave his 2 weeks' notice. He had no idea how he would make a living or what the future would look like, but he knew he had to follow this new path. Elena was thrilled when he called to tell her about his decision. The research team had been hoping to find someone with David's abilities who would be willing to work with them full-time, traveling to different facilities and helping animals that traditional methods couldn't reach. Over the following months, David's life transformed completely. He learned to use his abilities more effectively, helping animals in ways that seemed almost miraculous to people who didn't understand what was happening. He and Elena developed a close partnership, both professionally and personally, as they traveled together to rehabilitation centers, zoos, and research facilities around the world. David also discovered that his accident had done more than just give him the ability to communicate with animals. It had opened his heart to a kind of compassion and purpose he had never experienced before. The scar on his hand, which had once seemed like nothing but a reminder of a terrible accident, had become a symbol of transformation and hope. Looking back, David realized that the worst day of his life, the day he was injured at the animal shelter, had actually been the beginning of the best part of his life. Sometimes the things that seem like disasters are actually doorways to something wonderful we never could have imagined. His scar hadn't just healed his hand, it had healed his soul and shown him who he was really meant to be.